Hello YouTube, welcome to another deck profile with me, Chocobilly. This week I'm going to be looking at a deck which I call First Strike Freeze. It's not particularly imaginatively named, but that's not what we're here to do. We're here to look at cool combos and weird decks. For those of you that are new here, I don't really do meta stuff, I just do interesting stuff, which sometimes comes at a sacrifice of winning potential, but I'm the kind of guy that likes to make stuff to just see cool stuff happen, not necessarily win the game. But that's not to say that these decks don't have some firepower behind them. So, looking at this deck, it is a Ice Lightning deck, and I run 23 forwards, 17 backups, and 7 summons and 2 monsters. Although really that monster is also a forward, or we utilize it most as a forward. So as you can probably tell from the deck, the idea behind it is that you have a lot of first strike forwards, which Ice has a surprising amount of actually, as does Lightning, and utilizing that alongside dulling and freezing your opponent's field out. What this does is it creates a situation where your opponent has lost a lot of their resources, either forwards or backups, so that means they have to pay for more things out of hand, or they, can't attack or block. And if they were to attack or block, they are then faced with lots of forwards with first strike, so even if you haven't been able to dull things out of the way, you at the very least have a good defensive board because your things have first strike. You need to be careful, obviously, of your opponent's forwards being able to gain first strike or having first strike as well, but that's something that you can deal with at the time, and potentially those will be the forwards that you will be dulling and freezing out of the way. So, just going through the cards then. First up, we will go with Agrias. So, Agrias gains plus 3000 power if you control an FFT character. That in and of itself is really, really powerful. But I run Duke Larg, who is a generic ice buffer. He also happens to be an FFT character. So that means whilst he's also buffing Agrias as an FFT character, he's also buffing her because she's an ice forward. So Agrias actually goes from being 5k to 9k just from having Duke Larg on the field, which is really strong. Then also when Agrias is chosen by opponent's summons or abilities, your opponent discards one card from their hand. Again, utilizing this alongside something like Biblos means that you can then dull and freeze things out of the way as well. And then finally, when Agrias attacks, you gain a crystal, and crystals can be used in this deck to either reduce the cost of summons or use them alongside something like Snow, where you can then freeze out your opponent's field. Next up we have Alba. Alba is just a generically good lightning card who you can use to just remove those cards from the break zone as soon as she enters, unless your opponent has an Amaterasu who can cancel the entry ability through something like that. She is going to get you some value just as a 2 cost just to remove something. If she ends up dying immediately, that's still fine, because getting rid of those horrible cards in the break zone is really useful. Getting rid of those Mind Flayers or those Zidans or just those things that are going to be plaguing your deck is really powerful, and just that alone I think is worth it. White Tiger Lassie Kunmi. So, as I mentioned before, he is a first strike forward. But he's only 6k, and that's one of his main drawbacks, is the fact that realistically first strike's only good if you are a big enough forward. But he also has a nice passive of one or more of your forwards you control are chosen by your opponent summons or its effects. It's cancelled if your opponent doesn't pay 3. So your forwards have to be chosen by the summons, so unfortunately things that are just a blanket effect don't really work, but still it means that if they do choose something they have to pay 3, which is a substantial amount, otherwise that summon gets cancelled, and that's pretty good in my opinion. If you're combining this with making your opponent discard cards, it's really powerful. Now, as I mentioned before, I've got Duke Larg in the deck, so that means hopefully White Tiger as standard becomes a 7k first striker, which is really good. Now, if you combine that with something like Lugay, so Lugay is now, you play White Tiger onto the field, you then put Lugay into the break zone to then make White Tiger an 8k brave first striker who kind of screws your opponent's summons. He becomes a very good card. Now obviously it does have to sacrifice a backup, but realistically that's still a lot for your opponent to have to handle, because he can attack probably safely. He could be a 9k if you've also got Duke Larg, and he's also a great blocker as well. Right, Protofalc Adams. So another card that kind of screws your opponent be able to target things, and again, a first striker. So if your opponent has 2 cards or less in their hand, Protofalc Adam gains plus 2000 power and first striker. This works excellently alongside something like Biblos or Agrias. If they want to get rid of those cards, they will end up either probably discarding, or if they target Agrias, they'll lose a card. If they let Biblos attack, they'll lose a card. So just a nice way to be able to basically buff out Protofalc C. And again, plus 2000 power and first strike, he becomes a 9k with first strike. Duke Largo on the field, then becomes a 10k first strike. You combine that with Luge, potentially a 12k with first strike and brave, so really strong. But then Protofalc Adams enters the field, you get to place 2 counters on him, and when he's chosen by a summoner ability, remove 1 manipulator counter from Protofalc Adams. If you do so, cancel its effect. So ultimately, he's got this great defensive mechanism where he could also be something like a 10k forward with first strike, but your opponent has to, you know, hit him at least a couple of times to get rid of his counters. And then if you've got something like White Tiger on the field as well, so then if it's a summon, they also have to pay the 3, otherwise it gets cancelled. This starts being a kind of control deck because you've got these horrible things where they have to pay lots and do things repeatedly just to get rid of these defensive mechanisms. But also, the forwards, even without those, are really big with first strike, which is quite scary. Zeramus, again, just a good standard Ice Lightning card. So when he enters the field, or attacks, choose 1 character, freeze it. That's backups as well, so just playing Zeramus, freeze a backup. If your damage 3 gains haste, attack with him, freeze another backup. That in and of itself is probably just worth it. And then at the end of each of your opponent's turns, dull all the forwards your opponent controls. And that is super scary, because your opponent will always forget about that ability. I know I have plenty of times. Yeah, just a standard really good card. You again can use something like Luge to make him big and brave and just horrible. But yeah, just playing him on the field, free something, let your opponent pass their turn, and losing all their forwards is a nightmare. Desh. So, damage 1, he gains first strike. Damage 3, when he attacks, he deals 2k to the board, and at damage 5, you can just put him in the field to break something. Damage 5 is super useful, but unfortunately, your opponent, if they ever see Desh or see you playing Lightning, chances are they will not let you get to damage 5. They'll take it to 4, and then they'll try to kill you. So yeah, having Desh to be able to put something in the break zone is great. Again, he gains first strike. That's really good. Now, he doesn't have as many good means of being buffed, unfortunately, because he is just a standard 7k first striker, but he, at least when he attacks, is quite threatening, and you combine that with something like maybe Luge, then he becomes, again, quite threatening. Null. So, similar sort of thing here to White Tiger. So he's a first strike, but he's a 6k, so not particularly great. But when Null is blocked, deals 6k damage to the forward that blocks Null. So you give him something like Brave, and plus 2k off of Luge, and Null immediately becomes a threat because he's an 8k first striker, and when he attacks and is blocked, you get to deal 6k to something, at which point he is then effectively a 14k attacker, which is really strong. Not to mention that the 6k might get to outright break something as well. Ultimately, there are probably better cards than this guy in the deck, or that you could put in the deck, but I included him because, 1, I don't play him very often, but 2, he's actually been a lot of help. When I've played with this card and attacks, and there might be forwards that have just that bit more damage, or, you can chip away at them with something like Desh, deal 2k to the board, you then attack with Null. Their forward might be a 8k, take the additional 6k, that then breaks them just from the 2 damage alone without Null even being blocked, so they can't throw in any first strike shenanigans in there either. So yeah, just being able to deal an additional little bits of damage as well is nice, but really, Null, not the best card in the deck, but still has saved my butt a couple of times. Bartendless. So I'm adding all the bad cards into this deck. Bartendless isn't a bad card by any means, but he just doesn't quite cut it. So when Bartendless enters the field, choose up to 2 forward opponent controls, deal each of them damage equal to its power minus 2000. So an 8k forward would take 6k. But this combined with Desh at damage 3, he can then attack, deal 2k to all your opponent's forwards, and actually those forwards will pop, provided they don't have some sort of damage mitigation ability. And then at the end of each of your opponent's turns, dull and freeze all the active backups your opponent controls. Now you combine this with Zeramus, or Zemus, I can't remember what it's called now. At the end of your opponent's turn, all their forwards go dull, all their active forwards, all their active backups become dull and frozen. That's a horrible situation to be struck with, and that's one of the reasons I include Bartendless, just because if you get that Wonder combo down and they don't have a retort, their turn is going to be horrible unless they can just use everything. But then, that plays into the fact of you having things like White Tiger on the field, because if all their backups go frozen, then they're going to have to start paying out of hand to cancel summons, if they can even play summons, because they have to use their hand to cast summons. So yeah, just Bartendless and Zeramus and White Tiger, all these tax cards work really well together. Snow. So, a card, again, that doesn't get much play, but one of the reasons I have a fair few crystal generators in this deck. When Snow enters the field, you may pay a crystal. When you do so, select one of the two following actions. Freeze all the forwards your opponent controls, or freeze all the backups your opponent controls. And that is actually really good. To be able to play Snow and just freeze all those backups, all those forwards. If your opponent has lost all their forwards because of Zeramus, or lost all their backups because they spent it all, it's grand. It's fantastic. And you combine that again with the tax elements where they're having to pay with their backups. You're then punishing that with freezing everything as well, which is really good. Alcid, standard ice lightning card. You play Alcid to play anything onto the field, and then you get to freeze 2 forwards your opponent controls with Alcid, and then another ice forward entering as well. When a lightning forward attacks, get to dull something out of the way. If it was frozen, it's now dull and frozen, and then when a lightning forward you control attacks, choose one forward, dull it. So, sorry. Yeah, you know what I'm saying. Just really good oppression. You get to freeze things out, you get to dull things out, and just all these things happening at the same time, and just playing things onto the field for free, super cheap. Just really, really powerful. Aronair. So Aronair actually only has one forward that she can bring in from the break zone, her damage 3 ability, and that is Alba. So maybe not the best in the world, but she has a decent damage 6, being able to give all your forwards haste. But the main reason I include her is the fact that she can become very big very quickly, and she has first strike. So you bring Aronair onto the field, and you don't even bring anything onto the field through her damage 3. If you've got a couple of forwards, she's now a 9k first striker. The more forwards you play, the bigger she becomes. Obviously you want to be careful of any board wipes, things like Shantoto or Susano, but still, big forwards with first strike are a big problem unless your opponent has an answer. Orphan. So, standard Orphan. Make your opponent discard a card every time you go to your attack phase, and you get to dull something out of the way, potentially freeze it as well. And this just plays into those more tax effects of getting rid of the cards out of your opponent's hand, freezing all your opponent's backups, not being able to cast summons because you've got White Tiger Glycine Nimbus on there, and it's just all these horrible things playing into one another and synergizing with one another so that your opponent really struggles to be able to do anything. Carbuncle, right, so moving on to the summons now. I mean, I love this little summon. Just the amount of times my opponent turn 1 has played 2 backups, and then my turn 1 has just been play Carbuncle, freeze those 2 backups, done. Maybe not the most efficient thing in the world, but it does stall your opponent's hand because generally they'll use those backups to then play more backups, at which point they then have to discard more cards out of hand, and let's say what they started, they play 2 backups, so that's 4 cards out of hand, they have 1 card left. 2 cards left, I can do basic math. They then go into their next turn, they don't have those backups to use anymore, so they've only got 4 cards on hand. If they want to play another backup, that will leave them with 2 cards at the end of the turn. 2 cards is that magic number, which applies for a lot of cards in Ice. And personally, I think using Carbuncle for that is not too bad at all. Glaz, again, just a useful ice summon. I don't have too many in the deck, but just being able to choose one forward, freeze it, deal at 7k, or to make your opponent discard. Just having that in hand to punish your opponent for doing something, I think is worth it. Shiva, choose one dull forward, deal at 9k damage. Very useful. Being able to deal damage to a forward and just kill it is quite good, to be honest, because you combine that with maybe your opponent's got a massive forward that they're attacking with, you use Shiva to do that, and then you block with a first striker. All of a sudden they are blocking for a lot more. But then all the ice forwards you control gain plus 3,000 power until the end of the turn. Being able to use that as well, or instead of, sorry, is really good because you might have a lot of forwards that have first strike and they can all block for massive amounts. And also really good if your opponent does play something like Susano, you then play Shiva to buff everything so they're actually out of Susano's, kill range. That's great. And again, its cost can be reduced through crystals as well, which is really useful. Zalera, just Ice needs a kind of sweeping board clear, and Zalera is it. So, yeah. Remora, again, cost can be reduced through a crystal, but buffing one of your forwards by 7k, killing one of theirs, hopefully, for minus 7k. That's quite a strong card, and I really like it. Biblos. Yep, every time your opponent discards a card, you get to choose one forward they control, dull it and freeze it. That's a super strong. If you've got something like Glaz in hand, you get to make them discard, maybe freeze one forward, that's already dull, and then you get to dull and freeze another forward as well using Biblos. Or just go to your attack phase with Orphan on the field, dull and freeze a forward, dull another forward. It's just fantastic card. And then when Biblos attacks, make your opponent discard a card, dull and freeze something. tale as old as time. Luge, so yeah, probably my favourite backup in this deck, just because so many of these forwards can become very troublesome once they become big. Like I said, my favourite is White Tiger, but then using it with something like the Sea Adam or Agrias, she can become huge as well. Just having all these massive problematic forwards which are really hard to get rid of, and if you're up against something like Fire, where your opponent has to deal lots of chip damage to it, but they're being punished for attacking it, it's just really, really good. Knight, just crystal generation, really useful. Also having that Knight to be able to just dull out a forward out of the way just for that final game push, super useful. Scholar, choose one forward, dull it, you can only use the ability for cast a summon this turn, just effectively adding a 1 CP cost to any summon, but to be able to dull something on the way. Again, I think it's quite worth it. And this also means that you could cast something like, say, Glacier, make your opponent discard a card, choose a forward, freeze it. You can then use Scholar to dull that frozen forward, at which point it's now dull and frozen. Yay. Nedging, I think that's how you say the name. Dull, choose one forward, cost 3 or less, it gains plus 1,000 power until the end of the turn. You'd be surprised how many people forget about this card, and I mean that as in when it's on your field. Just maybe they attack, you block with a first strike forward, they then throw in some first strike trickery in there somehow, you then use Nedging to make your forward a little bit bigger, and they've forgotten about it, you then get to buff it. There's just lots of ways to be able to buff your forwards in this, and Nedging is one of the inspirations for actually building this deck, because it doesn't get played much, but it's actually a very, very good card, I think. To be able to just choose any of these forwards, which are generally really strong anyway, and just be able to protect them, buff them, whatever, it's just really good. Ninja, Crystal, also deal 1k damage, useful if you are a first striker. Obviously just bear in mind the fact that you can only use Ninja on your turn, so it means that you can only use it when you're attacking, not when you're blocking. Duglarg, gone over this already, just buff all your eyes forwards when they've got first strike, really good. Lumina, there's a lot of Final Fantasy 13 characters, or forwards in this deck. Snow, I've already forgotten them. Snow, Knoll, Bartandalus, Orphan. Yeah, just having Lumina to be able to search those out and play them onto the field, I think is quite worth it. Some of them better than others, but I still think it's worth having a search in there just to get one of those forwards out. X-Death, again, standard great card. Break any forward, and then bring a forward of cost 4 or less in your break zone onto the field. If it's Alcid, you then get to play something from your hand as well. But yeah, just having recursion is really, really useful, as well as breaking something. Just be careful of Amaterasu, because I've been bitten by that more than once. And then his S is also just really, really good as well. You might want to run 3, but I generally only run 2, because there's nothing worse than getting loads and loads of high-costed backups early on in the game. And then a few honourable mentions. So, to be honest, these are probably cards I should just probably run here instead of things like Knoll or Aranare, because they're a bit more consistent, but I don't build decks like that. So here, anyway, yeah, good cards. So Terra, as you can tell, I love this card, but yeah, being able to just play Terra on the field, reveal even one summon, you get to dull and freeze something out, but then you cast a summon, you get to dull or freeze both a backup and a forward, and that again is just super, super strong. Garland, a massive first striker without any form of buff. The one problem is the fact that he has to break something, but that's not the worst thing in the world. There's lots of backups that you'd be willing to break, maybe even some forwards that you'd be willing to break. You just play Garland onto the field. He's there, he's huge, he's first strike, and he's not going away anytime soon. And Nedging can buff him, so you can then just become a 10k blocker as well. Lastwell, maybe you're running lots of knights. I mean, we've already got Agrias in there. Garland is also a knight. Just when Lastwell or Job Knight enters your field, choose one character, dull it, and freeze it. Character, you can dull and freeze your opponent's backups, just really, really strong. And at the end of the turn, if a Job Knight you controlled attack this turn, your opponent discards one card from their hand. So again, Agrias attacks, or Garland attacks, or Lastwell attacks. They get to discard a card. If you've got Biblos on the field, you then get to dull and freeze a forward out as well. And then Orphan, you also get to dull another forward. Now it's at the end of the turn, so their forward will reactivate anyway, but still really good. Shantoto, again, standard good ice card. You can use her action ability, pay a crystal, because there's lots of crystal generators in the deck. So ice and something and a crystal, just dull your opponent's forwards. Great for that final push, or great if you want to use alongside something like Snow. Now obviously, playing Snow onto the field, you then have to pay a crystal as well, so you want to make sure you've got 2 crystals, but not hard to do, to be honest. Dull them all out, then freeze them all. that's not too bad. If you look at it as Snow effectively being a 6 CP forward and you have to pay 2 crystals, I guess that kind of works that way as well. But yeah, also Shantoto is another form of recursion. If your opponent has 1 card less in the hand, that also means she becomes only 1 CP to cast as well, so that's really good. But just being able to recur cards back to your hand is really useful. Lan, Lan and Rain I think are great. I actually prefer Rain, but in this sort of deck I think Lan's really good because you have to remove a monster from your break zone when you play him. If you do so, he becomes a 9k, which is really good in and of itself. But then also every turn, and that's each player's turn, or at the beginning of each player's attack phase, sorry, you get to dull something else out. So you get to go, say you play him your main phase 1, go to attack phase, dull one of your opponent's forwards, you then let their turn roll around, that forward reactivates, but then they go to attack phase, and you get to use Lan again. So really, really good, I think. Ultimately, you would want to have more monsters in the deck, because at the moment I only have 2 Biblos, but that isn't too hard, to be honest, and you could sacrifice some of the summons for more monsters. And there we go. This is a really, really fun deck to play because it's got so many elements of control, but also elements of aggression in there as well. You've got lots of haste things in there, you've got massive forwards at first strike, but then you're also freezing out your opponent's backups, you're freezing out their forwards, you're making them discard. There's all these mixture of horrible things. Tell me what you guys think of this deck. What would you change? How would you, move this around? Maybe you just take the lightning out entirely and just have lots of first strike ice cards, because there are a lot of first strike ice cards. But yeah, I think it's a lot of fun to play and it did alright. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, guys. Stay safe, be lucky, and I'll see you next video.